Cambrian period, between 542 to 488 million years ago, was one of the rapid plate movements. Most of this was an extraordinary explosion in animal diversity. Many of these new forms evolved the ability to biomineralize. This probably occurred in response to the evolution of predators, soft-bodied animals. From this period are preserved in localities such as Canada's Burgess Shale and Shandong in China. During this period of sea level rise, continents were inundated apart from Gondwana, eastern Siberia, and Kazakhstan, which were mountainous life proliferated in warm, shallow water marine environments. Almost all life was found in the ocean during the Cambrian period. It is believed that there were 15,000 species that evolved during the Paleozoic Era. Trilobites dominates the Cambrian fossils record, and these arthropods appear families near the end of the Cambrian. Hence, the Paleozoic is sometimes called the age of trilobites. Is Olilenos, a trilobite, an instinct arthropod common in restricted to early Cambrian rocks 542 million to 521 million years ago, and thus a useful guide fossils for the early Cambrian. Olinellus had a well-developed head, large and crescentic eyes, and poor developed small tail. Olinellus was a key fossil used by a Canadian geologist Tuzo Wilson to show that there was once a proto-Atlantic Ocean that separated much of the continental North America and Western Europe. The fossils of this species are mostly found in Greenland and Scotland. So this is the paradox side. A trilobite, an extinct group of arthropods found as fossils in Middle Cambrian rocks of North America and Western Europe. Paradox side has a well-developed head region terminating laterally in pointed spines that vary in development from species to species. Paradox side is useful in correlating Middle Cambrian rocks and time. So this is Olinos. A trilobite fossils commonly found in dark mudstone which were deposited on the seafloor in environments with low oxygen levels. It had up to 15 thoracic segments with very wide pleural or side loops. These are thought to have supported expanded gills which would have helped the animal absorb the maximum amount of oxygen possible in such an environment. The fossils of this species are greatly found worldwide. The Cambrian was a crucial period in the history of life on Earth, witnessing an explosion in animal diversity. About 540 million years ago, the seas were home to the first wave of new animal groups, some of which would eventually die out, but others would lead to the evolution of the first vertebrates. The start of the Cambrian is marked by the appearance of the vast array of animal forms.
Ordovician period. This period occurred between 448.3 to 443.7 million years ago. It lasted for about 45 million years in total. During this period of time, there was a lot of changes on Earth. Did you know that coral ecosystems started to form, and trilobites and sponges are in abundance during this period? Yes, you heard it right.
The Great Biodiversity Event led to tripling of marine diversity, the greatest increase in the history of life, and giving the highest levels of diversity seen during the Paleozoic Era. As a result, all of the common invertebrate fossil groups and a few vertebrates were present by the end of this period.
As you can see here, these fossils from Natural History Museum supported the claim that corals started to form during the Ordovician period. These corals appear in the fossil record for the first time early in the Ordovician period. Tabulate colonial corals are the first corals to appear in the fossil record. By the Middle Ordovician, rugose corals appear. These are specimens of solitary rugose corals. There's also a rich new fauna of trilobites appeared in the Ordovician, contributing to the significant ongoing Cambrian fauna. You can see here the 9 specimens representing 6 genera. Trilobites also began to develop the ability to roll up like an adorable little ball to protect themselves from predators during this period. Sea stars and crinoids also first appeared during the Ordovician period. There are also fossils of colonial animals that is believed to exist during the Ordovician period called graptolites. Did you know that fishes also exist during the Ordovician period? This period heralded the rise of the fish, some of the very first true vertebrates.
There were ostracoderms, which were primitive jawless fish without paired fins. They were armored with a coat of large bony plates or scales. They were the first fish to use their gills for breathing only, feeding with pharyngeal gill pouches.
There are also species that diversified and grow in size during the Ordovician period, such as the gastropods and cephalopods.
An example of this is the squid relatives, such as nautiloids, began to show up dominating the waters as some of the most fearsome and efficient predators of the time.
Now let's go to the Ordovician paleogeography.
During the Ordovician period, 4 major continents were present and separated by 3 major oceans. The Craton of Laurentia, which is made up of most of these countries, straddled the equator and was rotated approximately 45 degrees clockwise from its present orientation. The Craton made up of Siberian and Kazakhstania lay east of Laurentia along and slightly north of the equator. The Iapetus Ocean separated these two land masses on the south from Baltica Craton, which included present-day Scandinavia and north-central Europe. The Paleozoic Sea separated Avalonia, Baltica, and Kazakhstania from the supercontinent of Gondwana, which consisted the following countries.
All of the major tectonic plates were in motion during the Ordovician period.
Laurentia gradually rotated counterclockwise as Siberia-Kazakhstan approached it from the east. Baltica drew toward Laurentia from the southeast, gradually closing the Iapetus Ocean and ultimately colliding with Laurentia in the Silurian period. The Paleozoic Sea also gradually narrowed as a subduction zone on the west side of Gondwana consumed the ocean floor. Gondwana itself underwent a gradual clockwise rotation in the Ordovician, bringing Africa over the South Pole and Australia and North China across the equator and into the northern hemisphere.
And during the latest Ordovician period, a mass extinction wiped out 85% of marine species and is the second largest mass extinction of the Earth.
Hello everyone, I am Brooks M. Johnson. Join me as we journey back to the Silurian period. The Silurian period lasted about 28 million years. It began 443 million years ago, and with it came a vertical first for our planet. A warm climate and high sea level gave rise to the large reefs in shallow equatorial seas.
During the Silurian period, the atmosphere came to contain the optimum concentration of oxygen for creating ozone. The maximum ozone production in the upper atmosphere occurs when the oxygen content is approximately 10% of today's level. At this concentration of atmospheric oxygen, the ozone layer provides the most effective protection against lethal ultraviolet radiation. This is approximately where it stood during the Silurian period. The environment for once seems to be leveling out at a stable temperature. The Earth warmed back up, melting the ice caps, and the sea levels rose yet again, creating all new niches for all new creatures.
One of these creatures is coral. The Silurian is when we see the global rise of coral reefs. The continents were also very low compared to today, allowing the oceans to cover even more of the world. Life on land was beginning to pop up here and there, but the Silurian is a first and foremost an aquatic period.
Another creature that began to disperse around the world were fishes, at first being jawless and boneless. These boneless fish were in the class Agnatha and were related to modern lampreys and hagfish.
These were the most common fish, but soon they began to joined by a new kind, which is the jawfish. A group called Cathodians, or spiny sharks, evolved more menacing mouths with jaws, while this fish, the first true jawfish, reached no great size during the Silurian. They were on their way to becoming one of the planet's top predators. Another milestone for the fishes is that they began to go upstream into the continent and adapting to more freshwater locals, probably following the plants that climbed up the rivers as well. The plants also continued climbing out the water. A journey began in the Ordovician period. First lichens and mosses, and then vascular plants, mostly a genus called Cooksonia. Vascular meaning they are able to transport nutrients and water to their bodies. They didn't, however, have leaves and most likely just used their green stalks to soak up the sunlight for photosynthesis. They are mostly stuck to living near rivers and other water resources from which they came. Joining the plant kingdom of the land were representatives of our own kingdom Animalia, specifically arthropods and arachnids. One of the first that we have body fossils of was a species of millipede called Pneumodismus. It was around a centimeter long and looked pretty much the millipedes we have right now. But don't let its familiarity fool you. This little bug predated the first vertebrates on land by 50 million years. The Ordovician Silurian extinction was hard on Earth, even hitting the trilobites. But trilobites to scrape by with 63% of the pre-existing genre, surviving into the Silurian. You go, trilobites! The climate remained warm and stable throughout most of the Silurian. The supercontinent of Gondwana was still positioned over the South Pole, but the vast ice caps of the late Ordovician period melted almost to nothing. Sediments formed from massive quantities of broken shells suggest violent storms were triggered by the warmth of tropical oceans. Silurian, due to a close with a series of extinction events linked to climate change. However, these were relatively minor compared with those of other geologic periods.
Have you ever seen a shark or any sea creatures that make you shake in fear? Have you ever imagined a place full of moss and a dense forest? Well, that's just only a shallow information of what we had back then. Hello everyone, I am Julius Cesar Villabulisos, and I will be taking you back in time, where marine life was still the ruler of the earth. $416 million years ago, the Earth was covered by 85% of ocean water and has only two supercontinents, Gondwana and Laurussia. These two major supercontinents gave minerals to ocean water after one of their mountain ranges eroded and the sediments provided nutrients to the ocean that allows the marine life to flourish. This period was called Age of Fishes for a reason. Beneath the ocean was a diverse and complex group of marine life: trilobites, crinoids, gastropods, and many other more. On the top of that, there were two prominent group of fishes back then, namely the agnathans and placoderms. Agnathans are a type of jellyfish that lacks a biting apparatus and possess a single nostril. Some examples are hagfishes and lampreys. On the other hand, placoderm, a mighty and terror fish, was considered to be a top predator back in time. Let's take Dunkleosteus for example. Dunkleosteus had one of the most powerful bite of any fish, well ahead of all modern-day sharks. Its bite could concentrate a force of up to 8,000 pounds per square inch, powerful enough to break your bone in an instant. These diversification occurred for over millions of years. The changing land and freshwater environments fostered the evolution of some fish into tetrapods, and vertebrate land animals such as scorpions, spiders, and wingless insects also began to thrive in the new environment created by vascular explosion. The Devonian vascular plant explosion gave rise to the vascular plant groups, lysophytes and euphylophytes. These plants transformed Earth's environment, creating extensive marshlands. The new forest, dominated by the first trees, created a new biosphere and altered global carbon cycling. These cascade of events have led the end of the Devonian period. Mass extinctions happened due to global cooling, glaciations, oxygen loss in oceans due to oxygen-eating bacteria, killing about 20% of all animal families and 3/4 of all animal species. And today, fossils are found throughout the world and being studied for what benefit it could offer. After the vascular plant explosion, class of trees and plants have sprouted all over the place, making the insects of Carboniferous period exist for around 359.2 to 299 million years. This period was also known for its vast swamps, which dominated the earth, and giant insects, which is 3 to 4 times bigger than today's living insects. Because of the runaway plant growth, the Earth's atmospheric oxygen resulted to an increase for about 35%, making the temperature cool and mild. Some of the vascular plants and trees absorbs the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and releases oxygen in a process called photosynthesis. Some of you may wonder, why can't we reach the same amount of oxygen? It's like back then. It's because wood-eating bacteria haven't still existed during that time. Now let's add the overflowing pollution caused and produced by human. These events made the prehistoric insects to grow in size, like for example, Meganeura. It is a dragonfly, a giant relative of today's dragonfly, that had a wingspan of about 70 centimeters, more than 3 times larger than the biggest living dragonfly. Carboniferous period was divided into 2 sub-periods, Mississippian and Pennsylvanian. During Mississippian, shallow seas covered much of North America, making most of the rocks limestone due to vast marine environment. Pennsylvanian rocks, on the other hand, are most likely bituminous coal due to vast swamp forests. Such swamps produce the coal from which the term carboniferous or carbon-bearing is derived. Again, the Carboniferous period lasted from about 359.2 to 299 million years ago, and they were sustaining us for thousands and countless of years from their fossil deposits.
For most of Earth's 4.5 billion year history, the only living were microscopic, single-celled organisms. Once the Paleozoic Era began, about half a billion years ago, there was an explosion of complex life in the oceans. Over the next several hundred million years, life started to slowly colonize the land. But these assemblages of life were still mostly relegated to the edges of the water. But by the time the Permian had begun, the last pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place. Fully terrestrial, water-independent land ecosystems. These ecosystems would continue to grow. The Permian period is the sixth and the last period of Paleozoic Era, lasting from 299 to 252 million years ago. At this time, the Earth's land masses are mostly clumped together into the supercontinent of Pangaea. At the beginning of the Permian, the ice age that began the later Carboniferous is still ongoing, and the South Pole is still covered by a massive ice sheet. Unsurprisingly, conditions at this point in prehistory are much colder than usual, similar to today's climate, but that's where the similarities end. Because of the recent proliferation of land plants across the continents during the Carboniferous, the atmospheric oxygen levels are at their highest ever point in the Earth's history, at about 35% of the atmosphere, compared to today's 21%. And although the Earth's spin had slowed down significantly since the beginning of the Paleozoic, the days are still under 23 hours long, while sea level is about 200 feet higher than today. The interiors of Pangaea are filled with dry areas, but the wetter areas still harbor swamps that are a lot like those of the Carboniferous. And because of the high levels of oxygen, giant insects and other arthropods are still flourishing. Among vertebrates, there are still primitive amphibian-like tetrapods, but now they have been joined by more advanced species that can lay eggs on land. There were forests of early bearing plants which could reproduce without much need of water. This adaptation would come in handy for later because these colder, wetter conditions would not last long. The Permian is divided into three epochs: the Caesarean, Guadalupian, and Lopingian. Each of these is divided into stages, and as the Permian goes through these stages, the climate becomes much warmer and drier. And the forests of lycopods and other primitive plants would continue to disappear. The oxygen level would drop, meaning no more giant arthropods. Among the insects, Indopterygota are the ones that undergo fourth step of metamorphosis, and it's during the Permian that we see the early conifers and cycads proliferate. And land ecosystems will become dominated by carnivorous and herbivorous. Meanwhile, the ancestors of dinosaurs and other reptiles would diversify, with some of them becoming aquatic, joining marine communities full of strange Paleozoic sea life. And Permian seas contained reefs populated by a menagerie of ancient mollusks and arthropods, as well as sharks, giant proto-amphibians, and more modern fishes than previous period. Asteroid strike and volcanic activity has proven to be being the cause, as the ash of the impact would have blocked the sun and caused temperature to fall rather and rise on top of that. And at this point, 10% of the Earth's biodiversity was gone, as the Permian ended with the greatest mass extinction of all, with an estimated 95 of all marine and 70 of terrestrial species dying out after volcanic eruption poisoned the oceanic and atmosphere.